We are live, ladies and gentlemen. It's good to see everybody again. It's been a while since I've been here with Tiger Emissary, but welcome back to the Dr. Bob YouTube channel. This is what we'll just call the Doctor's Office podcast going forward. We'll bring on various guests. Tiger Emissary will be one of the frequent ones. We'll see how often I get to do this. You know, it's a busy schedule at the hospital. Tiger Emissary is a very busy engineer, so he has a lot of stuff as well. But I figure this can be just sort of a fun stream where we go through some various stuff that's going on in the church and in culture at large. And not that we're teachers in the church or anything like that, but I think we have some helpful commentary to give. At least I think Tiger Emissary does. So say hello to the audience, Tiger Emissary.
Hey everybody. Yeah, I hope I can live up to your standard that you're setting for me.
We're all about standards here.
That's right.
This is the United States in the year 2020, year of our Lord 2022. So standards are
they're all in transition.
Well,
So, as some have said.
That's a great segue, Tiger Emissary, to talking about our first story, which is the kerfuffle that happened this past Friday with the guys over at Cross Politic and the now infamous commentary on Baptist theology and transgenderism. Do you want to fill in the audience the basic gist of the story?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I will say Cross Politic guys are doing what they can to increase traffic these days. And if all the memes that you sent me are any indication, it's good quality stuff right now. But the Cross Politic guys brought in a guest. I don't know how often they've had him in before, but he seems to fit right in. Mr. Farley, I think. And just to kind of give the soundbite intro, I guess, he maintains that the trans revolution that we're seeing and that we're in the middle of right now is owing in no small part to Baptist theology and Baptist Christianity that's prevalent in the USA, and that just American Christianity has been infected by a kind of individualism that finds its root at Baptist theology that denies the sacrament to 8-day-old infants instead of believers who are confessing the faith. So that's it in a nutshell. And there's plenty of memes. There's plenty of responses that have flown back at the Cross Politics guys, which is probably what they were going for, to get some more views on the Canon app and the YouTube channel. So I can't blame them for kicking the hornet's nest like they have.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I was actually had some very interesting interactions this past week with both a friend of mine who is in the CREC here in the old North State, just north of you, the larger of the two Carolinas. And he was actually quite sympathetic to the Baptists who were complaining, and thought that Farley's commentary was sort of a little bit over the line. Not that he may not have had some legitimate criticisms, and we'll get into this a little bit. This is I think an excellent time to talk about church history and how the church in America in particular is developed, and maybe some of the threads that have led us to where we're at today, as well as how that has interacted with the wider culture. But yeah, my CREC friend was actually very complimentary of the Baptists and was very sympathetic with the outrage as well as the memery that was being sent back and forth. But it's interesting. I actually have a brother from my church who is at our Credo Baptist church. And while he believes in believers' baptism, he is otherwise a Westminster guy and definitely is against what he sees as the primary Baptist distinctives of autonomy of the local church, as well as the Baptist distinctive that he sees it as separation of church and state. He was actually trying to argue in a different way than Jason Farley was, that Baptists are in fact responsible for transgenderism, but in a different sort of way. We can get into that a little bit. I think his reasoning, as he and I were going back and forth, we started memeing each other talking about obtuseness. I thought that he was trying to make a very esoteric and obtuse point that was missing the forest for the trees. And in particular, I was trying to get him to see that the kind of society and, shall we say, Doug Wilsonian sort of near Christendom is just not a historical reality in church history, and that for somebody who comes from a low church or a free church, however you want to define our particular sphere of evangelical Protestant Christianity, that has never meshed well with state control. So yeah, I figure that would be something that we could discuss a little bit as well. But maybe if you want to talk a little bit, Tiger Emissary, about how you sort of got into this space, maybe following Doug Wilson and some of the things you found helpful from him, and what do you see as some of the strengths of that sort of Christian Reconstructionist position that Longshore and Farley and the cross-politic guys were expressing, and where do you think some of the pitfalls in that particular perspective might lie?
Right. So I think I've been following Doug Wilson for better part of 11 or 12 years. Kind of started finding his blog stuff, I think, around the time he first did some work with John Piper. I think it's probably how I stumbled on him, but started reading his blog. And then in the last few years, his Canon Press and Greater Moscow Broadcast Network, they've really expanded their media empire and the kind of content that they're putting out. But all on the way, I've just followed Wilson mostly. And I know he's made some appearances on the Cross Politics show, and he's got his fingers in basically all that's happening there, the new St. Andrew's School. So there's a lot of good things that have come out of his work, his ministry, and the things he's doing. So just wanted to kind of put that on the front end. But I would think, you kind of touched on a few things that your friend mentioned, kind of the magisterial side of things, and then the covenantal theology side of things that are both somewhat peculiar to Wilson, or at least his brand of those things, his brand of magisterial Reformation, his brand of covenant theology. And both of them are at odds with the traditional Baptist or even the particular Congregational Baptist, the original OG Baptist theology of the 1689. So anyway, those are areas where you and I would differ from him and the Moscow folks, particularly the position between church and state and the position between the believer and how the believer relates to the covenant of grace and the broader community, as we would define it. It's different from how they would define it. So I think probably the first thing that got me invested into the whole debate, I remember a debate between James White, Dr. White, and Doug Wilson a number of years ago, and the premise was, are Roman Catholics brothers and sisters in the Lord? And the debate focused on, is Roman Catholic baptism legitimate? Do we say these are fellow brothers based off of this profession of faith? Profession of faith being, we identify God as the triune God, with the Athanasian and the Nicene Creed. We're baptized into that name, that triune name, and we call them brothers based off of that. So that was Wilson's position, and James White's position was, hey, you're calling these guys brothers when Scripture calls them false brothers. Quoting Apostle Paul, if I or an angel or any other comes and preaches a gospel different from the one you heard, let him be accursed. And that would be the kind of gospel that's getting preached by the church in Rome, or any other distorted view of salvation by grace alone through faith. And so, hey, are we right to call them brothers? Are we going to make the tent broad enough to say, hey, based on their baptism, we're going to call them brothers, albeit false brothers? Or to use Wilson's analogy, hey, they're married to the church. They're a husband married to a wife, but they've been unfaithful, which doesn't mean they're not a husband anymore. They're not unmarried because they've been unfaithful. They're just unfaithful, and they need to be called back into a faithful marriage, faithful relationship with the church based on faith alone rather than works. So that was the position, that was the debate that got me involved to see, okay, my Baptist position on baptism, does it jive with what's accepted in broader Reformed world? And so I've always held Wilson and his guys as being at least a representative of the general Reformed view. And as I've heard from him, I've heard from other debates kind of around the issue, the Reformed folks, Presbyterian folks, always like to get their shots in on the Baptists, and we do the same. we always, I say we, those of the Baptist stripe tend to give a caricature sometimes. Hey, if you're accepting infant baptism, that's one of many things you agree with Rome on. And so, hey, it might be a slippery slope from there, which is a bad way to argue, but it sounds like Mr. Farley and the cross-politic guys are using that way of thinking, using that kind of argumentation themselves to say, hey, you guys, you Baptists are guilty of overemphasizing this individualistic view of salvation in your baptism, and therefore you're guilty of promoting a very individualistic understanding of the faith and an individualistic of understanding truth. And so, hey, if you are promoting this, then you are a part of the problem. You are part of the problem that's plaguing the church, where we have supposed pastors and supposed teachers who are, saying this is God's will and this is God's design, that people would transition out of the sex that they were assigned at birth, that this is actually their true self, their true identity coming to light. And it's all because of a individualistic understanding of truth, an individualistic understanding of ontology. And so that's the argument. That's what's put forward by Mr. Farley and the cross-politic guys. But that's kind of a more full explanation of as what I see going on. Just wanted to kick it back to you, Bob, and see what you think. Is there any critique of that? Want to add any color to that?
Well, hold on 1 second. All right. Trying to sneeze here. Anyways, if I may, Tiger Emissary, how about I just sort of give an overview of the history of the institution, the sacrament, the ordinance of baptism itself, just sort of where I see the chips lying in this particular argument. And then maybe once we have the history fleshed out a little bit, we can draw some inferences on where the difference might be and why Mr. Farley made the accusations that he did. So if we go back to the New Testament, in terms of explicit references to baptism in the text, we think about the classic text of, Acts chapter 8, 32 through 37, the baptism of the Ethiopian eunuch. We think about Paul's baptism, all the other explicit references to baptism we have in the scriptures are what we would refer to as credo baptism, the idea that somebody has made a profession of faith. We see their conversion, and then they are baptized. And furthermore, that the mode of this baptism is through immersion, whether that be a lake or a river or some other natural body of water. There weren't baptistries in those days because there weren't church buildings as such as we know them today. But we see this pattern of credo baptism by immersion. But the theology is not exactly fleshed out. We see mainly descriptive instances in Scripture as opposed to prescriptive instances as to what baptism means. There are some notable exceptions to that. Peter in his epistles discusses, baptism now saves you, not as the washing of dirt, but, the cleansing of the conscience. And so there is some discussion that is given. But it's not what we see in later church history. So as I see it, as we move out of the New Testament period into the ante-Nicene period, we still see what looks like a predominance up until the time of Tertullian of believers' baptism. That is, we know the baptismal dates of many of the people that we have information on in that ante-Nicene period, and they're not children. They're baptized as adults or as adolescents. Not as babies on the 8th day. As we move into the imperial period, after the conversion of Constantine and then the making of Christianity the state religion of the Roman Empire by Theodosius, about 60 years after Constantine at the end of the 4th century, that's when we really start to see infant baptism come to predominate in terms of the subject of baptism, even though the mode of baptism is still immersion. All you have to do is take a look on YouTube or go to an Eastern country, whether that be in an Eastern Orthodox or an Oriental Orthodox or Church of the East or Eastern Catholic context, and they will often still immerse the babies 3 times in the water in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. So there's still immersion in the East, even though the subjects become infants. We see this in terms of Augustine's understanding of baptism over against Cyprian, who had lived about 150 years earlier. Augustine, being at the end of the 4th, beginning of the 5th century, is living at a time when Christianity is now the state church or the state religion of the Roman Empire, whereas Cyprian was living during the crisis period in the 250s when he was martyred under, I believe it was Valerian, who was the emperor at the time. And Cyprian had the idea of ex opere operanti, the idea that the baptism was only good if the person who was baptizing you was a faithful Christian. This was over against the Novatianist heretics who had existed at that time, who had split off from the main church in Cyprian's estimation. And so Cyprian, who was then martyred under the persecution, his view of baptism came to predominate. And so Augustine, as he often did, sometimes for better, sometimes for ill, was going against precedent when he propounded his view that is ex opere operato, in which it's not the operator who matters, that is the person doing the baptism, but what baptism is itself, that the sacramentum, as Augustine saw it, was efficient in and of itself. Modern Roman Catholics have sort of, I think, taken this a little bit to an extreme position that, a Buddhist monk could validly baptize a Christian. It's like, okay, I guess, but, we would have, some later developments in church history that sort of modify that position for us. We would agree generally with Augustine that doesn't matter. You could have, the pastor or the deacon or whoever is baptizing somebody, they could be a wolf in their heart, even though they're a member in good standing of that particular congregation who baptizes the subject, and the baptism would be seen as valid, even though, it may come out years later that particular, pastor or minister was a false convert or a heretic or an apostate. Doesn't matter. The baptism is still valid. So we would sort of agree with Augustine on those terms. There was actually a scandal within the Catholic Church a few years ago where maybe it was as recently as last year, where there are a number of baptisms that were ruled invalid because the specific words, or maybe it was like one word of the baptismal formula was changed. And so the Pope had those baptisms invalidated, and the people had to get, quote unquote, rebaptized, even though in the eyes of Rome, those baptisms were not valid in the first place. So that's the view that comes to predominate after Augustine. And specifically, you have a concept of baptismal regeneration that had been developing, but it really comes to full flower by the time you get to the imperial period of the church, in which it was seen that, especially in the West, that baptism was removing the stain of the guilt of original sin, especially in the Augustinian formulation. And so Augustine has the idea that baptism is always valid and always efficacious, and it leads to regeneration, but the way in which he explained people later apostatizing from the faith or becoming nominal or secular, as they grow up, was that the regeneration was not something that was infallible or ineffable. Now, he believed very strongly, as we do, in the concept of predestination, in which the elect's baptism would sustain itself or be sustained by God for the life of that particular elect individual, and that those who were elect would persevere. But the way in which he explained apostasy was that regeneration could fail, even though baptism was entirely efficacious, which there's some controversy here, and there's some conflict in Augustine's own theology, in which he has, on the one hand, the Donatist controversy, which is informing his view of baptism and informing his view of the church. He developed his idea of ex opere operato over against the Donatists. who claimed that those who had cooperated with the Roman authorities under the persecution, that line of bishops was somehow corrupt, and therefore all the sacraments that they gave were not valid. And so Augustine was like, no, that's not true because it's efficacious in and of itself. That's the view that comes to predominate in the Middle Ages. Where, on the other hand, Augustine has later in his life the Pelagian controversy, in which he has a very strong view of the depths of depravity and original sin, but also the absolute predestinarian position of the Apostle Paul, that God chooses those from before eternity past whom he will save. And God works out both the means and the ends of their salvation. Fast forwarding a little bit to the time of the Reformation, the magisterial reformers keep infant baptism, both for theological reasons as well as political reasons. I think Calvin sort of acknowledged the more political nature of why the magisterial reformers kept baptism as infant baptism. This had to do with the fact that Christian Europe post-Constantine had become a sacral society in which to be a member in good standing in the society, to be a citizen of that society, meant that you had to be baptized. This is why the Saracens were looked on as heathens, and if I may say, they are, and why Jews were persecuted in Europe, as they were seen as outside the norm of the sacral society that was Christendom within Europe at that time. And so the reformers are bucking up against this precedent. The Turks under Suleiman the Magnificent are invading from the east, and the reformers are being accused of schism and helping the opponents of Christ by helping the Muslims through dividing the church. And so the magisterial reformers could only go so far politically. And part of that included the institution of baptism. And so you have the Anabaptist movement, some of which was good, some of which was very, very bad. Case in point, the Münster Rebellion in Germany. That caused a stir. And so Calvin sort of reformulates Augustine's idea to where regeneration was entirely effectual and ineffable, but to where baptism was no longer seen as baptismal regeneration per se, but as more of a covenant sign. And so from my vantage point, Calvin really introduces what I consider to be a theological novum in church history. Of course, I would say Augustine's view at his time was also a theological novum in a sense, even though there was some precedent for his views. I think that Calvin was on the right track, but he kept certain things intact because if the reformers didn't have the tax rolls and the way of running their society that the organized Catholic nations did, then they would have lost the strategic position and the strategic footing in the conflicts that were going on in Europe at the time. So infant baptism was maintained, in my estimation, in part, if not in large part, for that particular reason. So this is the milieu in which the early English Baptists are coming in, where you have sacral societies in Europe, both within Roman Catholic nations, magisterial Protestant nations, whether those be Lutheran or Continental Reformed, as well as obviously the Eastern churches in Russia and the other countries in Eastern Europe at that time. And so the Baptists really have to tread carefully. The opening lines of the original 1646 confession was a repudiation of Anabaptist thought. It was to those who falsely call us Anabaptists. They were really distinguishing themselves from the Anabaptist movement that had happened on the continent. They really saw themselves within the continuity of both Calvin's work and teaching, as well as within the broader English Reformation as another dissenting Puritan style movement within the greater Anglican, or I guess what it had emerged at that time as the Anglican Communion. All of the early Baptists were Anglicans originally, and so they held to Reformed theology. They held to Calvin's view on many things, but came to, I see, rightly bring baptism back to the state of credo baptism. We reject baptismal regeneration. I think there are good exegetical reasons for that, even though I recognize that we are in a minority position in church history in that regard. But we saw that because the new covenant is composed entirely of believers, all you have to do is look at the epistle to the Hebrews to see that, quoting Old Testament passages such as Jeremiah 31, that the new covenant does not have people who, unlike the old covenant, don't make it. That everybody who is within the new covenant makes it. Those who want to try to take Hebrews 6 as a way of saying that there is apostasy in the sense that somebody could be regenerated, born again, and then become unborn again, and then in the Roman Catholic system, almost perpetual cycle of falling in and out of a state of grace is just not in the view of the author of Hebrews. I do believe is the Apostle Paul, especially when it comes to understanding chapters 7 through 10, which immediately follow, as Christ's priesthood is perpetual. Ta dianekes, the same term is used of what Christ has done for us in Hebrews 10:14 in regards to our salvation. That as Christ's priesthood is perpetual, the salvation of his elect is also perpetual. And so that's how I see that. And so that would be our general historic Baptist understanding of the covenant, as opposed to the Presbyterian understanding of the covenant, where the children of believers are included under the covenant sign of baptism in this more Augustinian ex opere operato sort of way, but just doing away with this sort of baptismal regeneration aspect. And so in terms of the conflict or the disputation between Baptists and Presbyterians, and then all of these sort of denominations and non-denominations that proceed from our various branches of free church Protestantism, really comes down to what our thought on the nature of the new covenant is. And so the Presbyterians would accuse the Baptists of being overly individualistic. You're demanding that somebody have some sort of experience or decision in order to be baptized, and that you start bringing in unbiblical concepts like an age of accountability, which is especially popular in the cults. Think about Mormonism or some of the other more restorationist type movements that are peculiarly American in their origin, that have their roots in the early 19th century. Whereas on the Baptist side, there becomes, I think, the pushback of, well, how are you guys different from Rome or even Canterbury? You know, how does this not lead to nominalism and the dangers of sacramental regeneration and a loss of um, individual responsibility to the covenant? And so that's basically where I see the battle lines. And so I see Mr. Farley sort of attacking us from a what I would consider a fairly traditional Presbyterian perspective, but I think he just sort of goes off the rails in his ascribing transgenderism to credo baptism. So, with that long monologue out of the way, what are your thoughts on the historical overview that I gave, Tiger Emissary? Do you have any pushback for that? Any further coloring you'd like to add, and maybe how that informs the present controversy?
No, that was great, and thanks for laying it all out there pretty comprehensively. No real pushback. I would say there's a lot that can be teased out there. You know, where you mentioned John Calvin, you know, introducing the idea of the baptism and covenant, a sign of the covenant piece. That was a new thing, and that becomes the distinctive for Reformed theology, Reformed covenantal theology. And I think that's what's carried along by the Presbyterians. This was carried along by, you know, in any Reformed branch from that tree. And what Wilson and his folks are doing is not new themselves. You know, the brand of Westminster Presbyterian type theology, they also want to say things about baptism that, in Wilson's words, you know, we have an objective sign, an objective baptism, that it actually does something. It means something, and not necessarily in an operanto or operanti. Not the action itself does a thing to you, but it means something. And I think to sort of argue for Wilson's case, to say, hey, that's the problem that we have right now, is that we've made baptism such a hazy thing where, hey, we'll sprinkle a child, we're going to administer the sign, but what does it actually do? Well, does it mean that they're regenerate? No, we're not going to say that. Does it mean that they're in the church? Well, yeah, but you know, are we saying that they're going to take communion, that they're going to participate in the body of the church in the fullest extent possible in all the ways that Scriptures lays out? Well, no, we're not going to do those things. And I say we're not going to do those things. That's sort of the popular Presbyterian view. And so Wilson and his group say, no, since this is an objective thing, we're saying once that sacrament has been administered, we're saying something new has happened for that child who's now in the covenant. You know, they're in Christ. They've been grafted into Christ. That's the language that they use. That just like John 15, they're branches that are grafted in. And if you have no faith, if you're not abiding in Christ, then those branches will ultimately be cut off. So they want this objective sort of thing where John 15 is real for everyone who's been baptized. You're in the vine, or to use Paul's analogy, you're in the olive tree, and you may be broken off if you have no faith. You know, ultimately the elect are those who believe and persevere. And he's saying in this objective sort of way, well, you really were in the tree. You really were in the vine. You weren't pretending to be in the vine. We weren't wrong to say, hey, you're a member of Christ. We made a mistake or whatnot. He's trying to draw a straight line to say, no, you're in Christ. You're baptized into the covenant. And I see this as being pretty consistent with a Westminster kind of theology. And to your point, you bring up Calvin, you bring up the Presbyterians, they can be quite inconsistent in what they do and what they practice and then what they teach insofar as the sacrament of baptism goes. They hold a reformed line that says, all those who are elect are those who will ultimately profess Christ, show obedience, and persevere to the end. And yet, at the same time, we want to maintain this kind of a invisible, visible church sort of teaching over here on the side, where baptism means you're in the church, but it doesn't have any sacramental and soteriological entailments. We don't want to say anything about baptismal regeneration. We don't want to sound like that. We don't want to bring in those problems, but we're not going to fully commit to this idea of you're in the church, you're in the new covenant. And that's what Wilson's doing. He's saying we need to be consistent. We need to stop drawing lines where our theology or where Westminster doesn't draw lines. And so all that to say, I don't agree with any of that, but I commend him and his group for being consistent. And that's what they're pushing for. And so that ultimately, to kind of turn back around, that's the critique that they're leveling at the Baptists, to say, okay, you're not consistent on the sign, on the soteriology, on the church. None of this. You are pushing a kind of individualistic, hey, it all depends on that individual's experience with God, that can't be falsified, that can't be rebutted, and we can't say one way or another because, well, they claim to have knowledge of God. They claim to have had a religious experience, and okay, well, I guess we have to baptize them now. So I think that's what they're looking at on the Baptist side, and it results in the common mischaracterizations, of course. But yeah, I think how you laid out the history of it. We're just seeing, two of many different traditions show up. The implications of Baptist theology and the Baptist tradition, and the implications of the Presbyterian and Reformed covenant theology, and their implications. There's many things that we would differ with the Presbyterians on, but this is one of those that just right now it's the hot thing. I mean, the battle lines right now are, those on the side of truth and those that are on the side of the LGBT plus divided by sign, ampersand, and whatnot, revolution. And so, the claims can stick, and the claims can carry a lot of weight when Farley lays them out like that. But you brought up a good point with Luther and the guys in the Reformation during the days of the Turkish invasion into Europe. Those battle lines were real then too, where if you were not on the side of Christendom, and you were not on the side of a united Roman Empire, Christian Empire in the West, you were opening the door for the Turks to come in and take over. If you were not going to stand with the rest of the church, if you were going to kind of go out in left field and push what what they saw as rank heresy from the Anabaptists, you were dissolving the strength that Europe had, and all the European nations had together against a really formidable opponent in the Turks. And so there really was some practical, cultural, realpolitik kind of problems that they were trying to address. But what happened, it seems to me like they used all of that to inform their theology. And that seems to be what's going on even now with the sexual revolution. And we've got battle lines that are drawn. And hey, are you actually helping? Are you in the fight against the LGBT plus revolution. Hey, this what we see as faulty ontology, faulty ecclesiology in how you're administering baptism. Hey, that's feeding right into the hands of the sexual revolution. And so, not to defend the claims that were made, but that seems to be where it's coming from. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. There's a lot that you said there that I think is really good. When I was wanting to get into maybe the specific accusation in regards to Baptist theology being responsible for transgenderism, I think you're right that Wilson has often said, and I've heard this said of him, that he doesn't want any problem verses in the scriptures, that he wants to be entirely consistent, which is very interesting in regards to his view on Paedo communion. That's actually the present Eastern view on communion. They also don't wait to have some sort of confirmation the way that Rome does. They go ahead and pour the oil on the baby after the baptism, and that's chrismation. And they don't wait for this sort of Western, as they would see it, style of, well, you get sprinkled, and which they would see as an improper mode, and then you wait until a certain age and you go through confirmation. And then once you get confirmation, that's when the Holy Spirit comes down. They're all trying to recapitulate what happened in the book of Acts. But what I see in a lot of this, for want of trying, but I try to distance myself from the higher critics. But I do think that this is something Schaff talks about in History of the Christian Church, and where my sort of alarm bells and desire for consistency is I think that all of the sacral traditions really are hard pressed for dealing with history as it actually happened. And if you go back far enough, you start finding Christians who don't look exactly the way that you do, who don't practice exactly the way that you do, who don't have a liturgy exactly the same way that you do. This is the problem with both Rome and the East, which have mutually exclusive claims to infallibility and being the quote unquote one true church, trademarked, copyright, all rights reserved, is that if you have an infallible church and you say that you look exactly the way that the early church did, that is a steep hill to climb. And in terms of falsifiable claims, you are opening yourself up to all sorts of liberal attacks. And this is exactly what happened in the 19th century with the Tübingen school and with modern higher criticism. And one of the things that Schaff points as a positive of higher criticism was that it sort of, in the objective sense, washed away a lot of the old bigotries and false conceptions of tradition and, ecclesiastical structure. That it really began to challenge things like the episcopate. And they obviously, and it's interesting, Schaff mentions that there were really two forms of higher criticism. The one that we think about, which is the bad kind, that comes from Ferdinand Bauer and the Tübingen school, which is really coming from a skeptical, atheistic point of view. Ernst Renan in France was also a part of that more skeptical school of higher critics that, they questioned miracles. They didn't believe in God, and they just basically wanted to create this sort of moralistic, therapeutic, deistic society, I think, as Al Mohler has called it before, to use the morals and the principles of, Christianity while getting rid of the sort of superstitious, antiquated things such as the miracles and that kind of stuff. but they're obviously being inconsistent. Now, there was a conservative group, believe it or not, that had some similar methodologies, but had different underlying presuppositions. And those were led by, on the continent, Augustus Neander, who I have a lot of affection for, being a Jew who had converted to Christianity and was a tremendous Lutheran scholar, the teacher of Philip Schaff, the great church historian. And also in England, the illustrious J.B. Lightfoot, who was, I believe, Bishop of Durham at that time. And they wanted to get to the truth of the matter and where do all these traditions and, structures and forms that we have in the church come from, but recognizing the inspiration of the scriptures and approaching the scriptures as historical documents that were produced in history by real men who lived in real places at real times. Completely, turning out the idea of Christ mythicism on its head, or on its face. These were men who believed that the scriptures were reliable historical documents, as well as the God breathed, word of God that had been given to us by Christ and his apostles. And I find myself more in alignment with that latter camp. But what I say all that to sort of say that I admire Wilson and the CREC Presbyterian sort of Reconstructionist guys for wanting to be consistent. But this is the fine line that I feel that we in Baptist circles have had to walk, and that I think we in the Free Church really have to walk. Because on the one hand is the imperial church and its sacral system with the sacral society, where you have a state church and nominalism and all other sorts of things that turn the gospel on their head. Just two examples: Hitler was baptized as a Roman Catholic as a child, as a baby, and Joseph Stalin was baptized in an Eastern Orthodox church as a child, and yet neither of them any Christian would claim is part of the people of Israel, the people of God, the church. And yet at one time you could say they were both part of the visible church. So what does that say about the new covenant? What does that say about regeneration? What does that say about justification by faith? If you can have two people who are supposedly given the sign, and if Christ is interceding for them, as Hebrews 7:25 says, for by one offering they were often for by one offering he has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. What does it say about Christ's ability to save his sheep? And so I think that's the line that Baptists have had to walk on the one side with the sacral churches, but then on the other side, the radical skepticism of our age, the absolute rank unbelief that I think James White has said quite compellingly, that Darwinism, you think about the four horsemen of the 19th century, Marx and Freud and Darwin and Nietzsche, that Darwin, to me, threw the most gasoline on the fire in terms of overthrowing our understanding of what it means to be human. We're no longer special creations made in the image of God, as Genesis 1 says, but we now are just, evolved apes from Africa who are in this long line. And it really is like a meta-narrative that you have with Darwinism, the entire story of evolution as you see it taught in classrooms today, and in the scientific community. And so it really is a fine line that we have to walk. And so I admire the desire for consistency, but I also want to know, well, what is the truth of the matter? And has God really spoken in that way? And so this is where I see sort of where Jason Farley is coming from. I see as he's coming from a good place, but what is his apologetic, against those who then start pointing out inconsistencies in his position, and how does he account for those? We all have inconsistencies. We all have blind spots that we have to account for. And so that's where I think the Reformation principle of reformed and always reforming comes in. So yeah, I'll let you comment on that, then I'll make one final comment.
Yeah, so you go upstream a bit. I think you were talking about this sort of at the beginning, and I wanted to kind of come back to this magisterial Reformation idea. We've talked a lot about the soteriological Reformation, but where Farley and the CREC guys are coming from, and Wilson calls what his project is mere Christendom, and I don't know if all CREC guys will align with him on it. He seems to be more moderate than some on this line, but the idea of, well, the goal of the church is to disciple the nations, and for them, they would define that as we need to disciple the nation state itself. Of course, individuals, but they said, Jesus's goal is to make disciples of all nations, and they really emphasize this idea of every nation needs to objectively and publicly confess Jesus as Lord. The view is that we would have the U.S. Constitution or some something along those lines, or an elected official saying, in God we trust, and Jesus Christ is his name, sort of thing, as a slogan for the nation. And that might be a mischaracterization, but I think it's accurate for what they're going for their post millennialism, what it requires, that this is what Jesus would have us do as the mission of the church. And so they see anything that would be a threat to that as, okay, well, that must be aberrant theology. So if you have a Baptist theology that does not allow for a church state relationship in such that, that we're going to have the official religion of the land be Christianity, or just at minimum, we're saying, in maybe Wilson's words, a mere Christendom where we're confessing Jesus as Lord over this nation, without subscribing to the Westminster or the Lutheran Confession of Faith or the Anglican doctrines. We're just saying that Jesus is the Lord of the land. We want to confess what the Bible says about our nation, and all that's commendable in and of itself. But I think where it gets down to practically is what we see showing up in Farley's critique and the cross politics guys. I mean, that's their show. That's what they're trying to do, is say, hey, Jesus's command to make disciples of the nation means go make disciples out of the public sphere, out of the civil magistrate itself. And so anything that's going to get in the way of a good ordered society, they're going to throw their critique at it. And, again, like you said, I have some sympathy for that, but it's not the biblical position. And it certainly doesn't bear itself out in history. We had 1,500 years of church history, really, since the time of Constantine and up to the 1500s, where, okay, we could say we had a Christendom, a form of Christendom, and it didn't quite work out. It didn't quite represent Jesus's kingdom on earth the way we are saying the goal is. Now, sure, you had kings and nations that, made Christianity the official religion. You had the sacral societies that were birthed during that time in the medieval period. But are we going to say that was actually the church doing the Great Commission? That was actually the fruit of the church being obedient to Jesus? And if so, if we say that, if we grant that point, well, what of the last 500 years after the Reformation? Isn't it working backwards, in that view, where you have now all of Europe minus a Poland or a lot of the Eastern countries that no longer confess Jesus as Lord over their nation. Never mind that they still have flags that were inspired by the cross in some form, but all of them, almost to a man, will deny the lordship of Jesus over their land or over their civil magistrate. You would have to see everything moving backwards if you see the post-millennial view of what the church was intending to do, that is not getting accomplished. And so I think that's coming home to roost a bit in the cross-politic, the CREC position is, well, we did have that. We did have a Christian nation that, insofar as it went, was confessing God's sovereignty and the providence of God in establishing our nation. And we had laws. Um, we had sabbatical laws in every state and blue laws in every county, and we had an acknowledgement of the lordship of Jesus in our country. But now, in the 20th century, we've seen that waning. So with the post-millennial view of what does it look like to fulfill the Great Commission, you'd have to conclude that we're going backwards. And so, but we know that's not the case. That if the gospel is to go throughout the world and the kingdom is going to advance, there's really nothing that's going to stand in the way of it. Not the LGBT plus revolution, not modernism, not postmodernism. It could not possibly get in the way. So if we're measuring the success of the kingdom by, how does righteousness look in the public square, well, we're going to be pretty disappointed. And if we're disappointed, we're going to be looking for someone to blame. Who's the one? Whose fault is it for allowing individualism and transgenderism to hijack our mission, hijack the kingdom of Jesus advancing in our land? And I think that's what we're seeing. Don't know if you agree with that. Just kind of throwing that out there. That seems to be the charge, that, hey, we're getting in the way of Jesus's mission by adopting this kind of what the CREC guys are saying is a faulty view of church and state and a faulty view of baptism.
Yeah. So here's a comment. I think I might know where this is coming from SMH BBAG1. Looking for comment. Roger Williams thought to separate the first table from the civil sphere. The last blasphemy law was gone in the 20th century. Then transgenderism less than 100 years later. So he is actually, I think, SMHB Bag 1 making the argument that I have heard that Baptists are, in fact, responsible for transgenderism because we were uniquely the first, religious group to separate church and state, to not have a sacral society. And therefore, because we have introduced this idea of separation of church and state, that allows unbelievers such as those who founded the Enlightenment movement to flourish and to succeed. And that it's all the Baptist fault because we allowed these people to come to the fore. And now we see the absolute transgenderism that we have today, not so much because of our view of baptism, as Jason Farley has said, but because of our understanding of the relationship of church and state.
Sure. Yeah.
So how would you respond to that particular perspective?
Yeah. So, you mentioned um, um, Scott, I think is Professor Scott Aniol. I don't know how to pronounce his name.
Yes. From
His article defending the Reformed Baptist position um, over against the cross politic episode. His point in that article was to say it's not the Baptist theology. It certainly is modernism and our psychological understanding of the self, that came through Freud, that came through Rousseau, that's come through even Darwinism, that has atomized man, and all that. That's much easier to draw a line from those ideologies and those things that deny Christ, to where we are now. You could say the Baptist position of separation of church and state. Well, we would have had a state, we would have had a government that was going to suppress any kind of, um, antichrist doctrine, antichrist ontology or anthropology. Well, I mean, I suppose you're right. We did have that in the continent and in England. We had states that were, going to suppress any kind of teaching that they saw as anathema, but the fruit of that was just as bad, if not worse, where you're putting folks to death for not confessing, what the government would have you confess. Where we have something similar now. We have, hey, we'll trans your kids if you parents don't confess what the state would allow. It's the same fruit in either case, but the problem being you have a man-centered theology, you have a man-centered view of the civil magistrate, and it doesn't do you much good nominally to say, hey, we're a nation that submits to Christ. It's fine to have that in our constitution, but at the end of the day, I agree with John Adams that our Constitution is written for a religious people and it won't work for anyone else. So it doesn't matter if the Constitution was as perfect as we would have hoped. A religious people is what we're lacking. A people that actually believes the biblical ontology and biblical anthropology. That's what got us to where we are, Baptists notwithstanding.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think this particular commenter is really trying to hit on Roger Williams's concept of soul liberty, which leads to the idea of the right of conscience, and that this is somehow a unique innovation of English Baptists. I find that to be untenable historically, and that you have to make many leaps of logic to get from that to the idea of transgenderism. If you look at the development of the scientific ideas, such as Darwinism, Freudianism, social movements such as Marxism, that I believe are all necessary to get to the point that we have today. These all developed in sacral societies, and there was not a Baptist in sight.
That's right.
There were blasphemy laws, in certain, Eastern European countries, even when, or other sacral societies in Europe. Look at Italy, look at France, up until the Revolution. And there wasn't a Baptist in sight.
That's right.
I think my friend who I was talking to, he made a very interesting comment that the French government had adopted a quote unquote Baptist government, as if Roger Williams's concept of liberty of conscience had led to the French Revolution in and of itself, or that it allowed these ideas to foster or to fester, even in a place like France. Well, first of all, France had toleration under the Edict of Nantes, in the late 1590s, where the Huguenots were given some freedom of religion. But then just, a generation or two later, you have the Edict of Fontainebleau, where freedom of religion was revoked in France. And there was no freedom of religion in France leading up to the revolution. And that these revolutionaries who were in France, were living and developing their ideas in a sacral society where you did have blasphemy laws, and not a one of them were influenced by Baptists or had the idea of Baptist theology. If they developed a concept of separation of church and state, it was from a very different stream, historically speaking, than, say, the English Baptists, who primarily immigrated to the United States. So I just find this kind of argument just historically absurd, if that makes any sense. Do you have any further comment on that?
No, I'll just say one last thing. I don't think Roger Williams claimed to be a Baptist for very long. As I understand it, he disavowed his Baptist denominational identification after about a year or two of having started the first Baptist church in Rhode Island. So, I mean, I guess he's a Baptist, but I don't know if any Baptists actually claim him.
Yeah, that's actually a point I hadn't heard, and that I think adds a little bit of extra to that. So to SMHBBag1 in the comments section, that's what we would say about Roger Williams, is that you are confusing cause with correlation and making lots of leaps in logic that haven't been demonstrated, and historically that just haven't been demonstrated as well.
Yeah.
Not to be rude or mean or anything, but that's just where we're at. Any final comments on this story before we move on to our next topic, which I imagine will be a little bit shorter on these next two. Let's go
rapid fire. Let's knock them down.
So there's an article in the Wall Street Journal last month. I'll just read a little bit to you, and maybe we'll link to this in the section in the notes. This article is called "Medical Education Goes Woke. Future doctors will be obliged to learn how health relates to systems of oppression." The woke domination of American higher education can seem tragically comic when it's confined to the English department, but when it infiltrates the hard sciences, far more is at stake. Read and wince at how woke politics is about to infect medical education. The Association of American Medical Colleges is a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. that represents and advises medical schools. It also has influence with the Liaison Committee on Medical Education, the national accreditor that sets medical school standards. So when the AAMC teaches schools to revise how they teach, America's future physicians will be obliged to listen. The AAMC recently released a report describing the, quote, diversity, equity, and inclusion competencies. There's your key phrase, Tiger Emissary. We'll continue on. That medical students and residents will be expected to master. Practicing physicians who work at teaching hospitals may also soon be required to undergo this form of, political re-education. As a starting point, aspiring doctors will have to become fluent in woke concepts such as, quote, intersectionality, end quote, which the AAMC defines as, quote, overlapping systems of oppression and discrimination that communities face based on race, gender, ethnicity, ability, etc., end quote. Med students who manage to avoid learning critical race theory in college will now get an immersive course. They will also be expected to demonstrate, quote, knowledge of the intersectionality of a patient's multiple identities, end quote, not to be confused with personality disorders, and, quote, how each identity may result in varied and multiple forms of oppression or privilege related to clinical decisions and practice, end quote. This sounds as if every medical diagnosis will have to be made with an accompanying political and sociological analysis. Aspiring doctors will have to learn that race is a, quote, social construct that is a cause of health and healthcare inequities, not a risk factor for disease, end quote. Yet racial or ethnic groups do sometimes have greater propensity for certain health problems. For instance, Black women are at a higher risk for a type of breast cancer known as triple negative, and women of Ashkenazi Jewish heritage are at greater risk of the BRCA gene mutation. Relationships between race and disease aren't always well understood, but knowing they exist can improve minority patient outcomes. It doesn't help patients with immediate needs for a doctor to assume that their condition is really about the, quote, systems of power, privileges, and oppression, end quote, in society. Med students will also be expected to articulate how their own, quote, identities, powers, and privileges, example, professional hierarchy, culture, class, gender, influence interactions with patients, as well as the, quote, impact of various systems of oppression on health and healthcare. Examples, colonization, white supremacy, acculturation, assimilation. Most young people who pursue a career in medicine want to help patients. Now they will be taught, quote, that an intricate web of social, behavioral, economic, and environmental factors, including access to quality education and housing, have greater influence on patients' health than physicians do, end quote. AAMC leaders write in a Stat News op-ed trumpeting their new woke curriculum. The implicit message is that the best way to help patients is to expand the size and scope of government. Social and economic circumstances clearly can affect the individual's health behavior, but hyperclass and racial consciousness that the AAMC wants to instill in doctors may result in worse care for minorities. Systems of oppression as a standard of analysis could easily become medical fatalism. AAMC leaders write further in Stat News that we believe this topic deserves as much attention from learners and educators at every stage of their careers as the latest scientific breakthroughs. That sounds dangerous. Will learning about mRNA technology or the latest treatment for melanoma take a backseat to new theories of cultural appropriation? America faces a looming and severe doctor shortage as baby boomers retire. It won't help attract prospective doctors to tell top students they must attend to their guilt as racial and political oppressors before they can diagnose your cancer. And that is the Wall Street Journal article, Medical Education Goes Woke. Wow. What are your thoughts, Tiger Emissary, as somebody who is an outsider to the medical profession?
Yeah, fearful. Fearful. For myself, I don't know if I'll be benefiting from all these DEI policies coming down the pipe. I don't know if it'll either be affecting my wallet or my kids. But no, it doesn't sound good at all, just on a personal level. But it is more woke stupidity for sure. We want to focus on the disparate things rather than actual scientific knowledge that is going to lead to a right diagnosis and treatment. That's just ridiculous.
Yeah. I think this actually gets back to our prior discussion and something that I've thought about a lot recently, in that postmodernism has essentially consumed its parent, that is modernism.
Yeah.
That the very scientific fields that came out of the Enlightenment and the modernist movement, which for better or for worse have led to the greatest technological innovation in human history, at least in terms of its aggregate effects upon human society, is now being consumed by a defective mutant offspring and postmodernism that is basically like acid eating out all of the achievements of modernism going back to the beginning of the Enlightenment.
Mm.
And we see this in a real way. I can't say too much, as you know, especially on YouTube about certain subjects, especially in the position that I'm still in. Maybe in a few years when I am in a different position professionally, you know why I have to tread with a lot of care in this particular subject. I can say more, but I think it's interesting that for the past 30 or 40 years, up until the past, shall we say, less than 5, things like objectivity, evidence-based medicine, principles of medical ethics, getting rid of paternalistic care, which were, I think, great innovations within medicine. Not always without their own problems, of course, but good innovations that actually helped patients within how we practice medicine have basically all been thrown to the wind in service of something else. Particularly since February, May of 2020, not commenting on any sort of infectious epidemiological circumstances that arose, but cultural circumstances that arose in the United States with certain highly publicized and politicized incidents of law enforcement interactions that have led to a cultural phenomena that has seemed to have taken on a desire, this almost insatiable desire to bring us to year zero as quickly as possible.
Yes.
Year zero, of course, being a Marxist idea that really saw its fruition in Cambodia, where I'm not sure how many people here know about what happened in Cambodia in the 1970s under I think it was Saleth Sar was his Cambodian name, but everybody knows him more by his, let me see, I'm looking him up real quick. Yes, Saloth Sar was his Cambodian name, but who everyone in the West knows as Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge regime. We think of this as some sort of faraway, distant thing that happened, but there are many people alive today who are alive when what was happening then was happening. What Pol Pot tried to do in Cambodia was an even more radical form of communism than had existed under Mao, in which he emptied the cities and sent everybody to go live on collective farms. And if you had glasses or looked like you came from the professional class, whether that be a doctor, lawyer, tax accountant, whatever it might be, these people were just summarily killed and executed by the regime out in rural areas that later came to be known as the killing fields. And Pol Pot's idea was that he wanted to destroy any vestiges of bourgeois society, like a good Marxist. And he sought to achieve that through this very reductionistic, zero-sum, true believer style of Marxism, where let's just get rid of all the bourgeois and just have a society made up of proletariat. And so I believe somewhere around 2 million people died. Somewhere between 10 and 25% of the Cambodian population was either killed or starved to death, which that always seems to be the story with any sort of Marxist movement, is that it starts off with quote unquote good intentions, and then it quickly descends into hell on earth.
Mm.
And there's still pictures of the mountains of skulls that existed and that were created under the regime of Pol Pot. What eventually actually ended his regime was an invasion by his neighboring communist nation of Vietnam. The Chinese communists and the Russian communists had already split in the famous Sino-Soviet split by this point, where Khrushchev and Mao had a falling out, and so Soviet Union supported Vietnam, whereas China supported Cambodia, and the Soviet Union was more powerful at that time. And so Pol Pot was ousted from power by the Vietnamese, acting on behalf of the Russians, which put an end to the insanity. But while we're not there yet in terms of the depth of depravity, and history is not cyclical, there are rhyming patterns, as the saying goes, to what we're seeing. The toppling of monuments, the renaming of buildings, renaming of scholarship funds, the changing of curriculum, the complete erasure of entire stories from the past from the official record, or the complete twisting of them outside of their original context, is happening in all aspects of society right now. And because of its prestige and its long history, the medical profession is front and center of that attack. Most of the doctors that I know are hardworking, caring people who want to do the best for their patients. But from what I've seen, the majority of my colleagues have a secular worldview that, it may work in a utilitarian perspective on the top end of things. When it comes to fundamental presuppositions, it's not the presuppositions that led to the development of the great medical field and profession that we have today. And we're seeing the hollowing out of medicine in so many different aspects, as you have seen play out in the public square in the past less than 5 years. And I think it's only going to get worse. I'm very pessimistic as to academic medicine, which is why I've considered a change in my sort of long-term goals. I considered a career in academic medicine for a long time, and I'm not entirely shut off to it, but private practice is seeming a lot more viable these days. Industry is seeming a lot more viable these days. But what I've discovered, even in an industry setting, having spent some time there as well for a little bit, is that it's infected even industry. Some of the companies that I've interacted with have more DEI, DEI, I guess that's their God, or DI, the DI religion, as I've heard Dr. Godsod refer to it as. It's even worse in some industry settings than it is in academia, if you can believe that. There are certain things I'll tell you offline, but just in terms of certain policies where I literally saw people go against their own best interest for the sake of this new woke zeitgeist, and it's just sad and depressing to see what's happened. with that. I actually did a podcast a couple weeks ago, maybe about a month ago now, regarding Dr. Kristen Collier at the University of Michigan. I'm not sure if you saw this story, Tiger Emissary, where she was I believe, an internal medicine physician at the University of Michigan Medical School who was giving the white coat speech. So for those who are not in the know, I explained a little bit of this during that stream, but the white coat ceremony is the intro ceremony. It's sort of like a convocation ceremony that you'll see at some colleges where, as the students enter into the school for their first semester, you'll go through official entrance ceremonies that sort of initiate you into being in that particular school. Well, this is virtually universal in the US and Canada, and I think even globally now, where medical students will receive their short white coat that only goes down to their hips, as opposed to the long white coat that they get upon graduation and entrance into residency. So this is a big deal. They'll invite, faculty and upperclassmen, medical students to come and give talks, sort of brief, sort of cliche kind of talks. And so Dr. Collier was actually selected by the Gold Humanism Society at the University of Michigan. Among the thousands of physicians who work at the University of Michigan, which is a very large academic medical center, one of the largest public ones in the country for certain, out of all the physicians, they chose her, which really speaks to her character. But she had done an interview with a Catholic magazine, even though I believe she's an evangelical, but just sort of a generic Christian magazine, saying the brief statement that she was pro-life. And as you can probably guess, Tiger Emissary, what that means in an academic setting today, especially in medicine, that's not good. So a number of the entering medical students came up with a petition online to try and get her canceled from being the sort of chosen speaker at the white coat ceremony. When that was not successful, when she got up to make her remarks at the end of the white coat ceremony, because the speech is always at the end of the white coat ceremony, about half of the medical students walked out of the ceremony in protest. Now, in terms of what her actual views on abortion are and what it means to her to be pro-life, it's hard to say. There's a lot of different definitions to pro-life, but the very fact that she even identified with the pro-life position in any sense was enough to have her tried to be canceled by a lot of activists, as well as by some of these entering med students. I'll credit the University of Michigan, which I would not have expected this to come out of the University of Michigan, that they stuck by their guns and did not allow her to be canceled. It's the same school where the football coach, Jim Harbaugh, also came out saying that he was pro-life, and the woke mob decided to come after Jimmy Boy. And the University of Michigan stuck behind Jim Harbaugh. And so kudos to the University of Michigan in this regard. But I think it's very troubling to see this kind of position being taken. I hope and I pray for the medical students there. I have no ill will towards any of them. I understand where a lot of them are coming from. It's not where I'm coming from. And I hope that during their time especially once they get on the wards for their rotations and see patients with all sorts of different diseases from all sorts of different walks of life, that it will give them a different perspective, that it'll allow them to be more humble and to give them the ability and the state of mind to actually treat patients who may have different political views than them, different religious views. I think, in the words of Vinay Prasad, who's a popular physician YouTuber here on social media, he said they missed an opportunity to hear what he said, and he's coming from a quote unquote pro-choice position, a very good speech, and something that even he, as a pro-choice person, thought was good. So looks like we lost Tiger Emissary here briefly. Looks like he's coming back in.
Sorry,
Looks like we lost you there for a second.
Yeah, fell out the boat, I guess.
I think maybe the FBI decided to take you offline, but I was the one who was monologuing, so I'm surprised they didn't try to take me offline. All kidding aside, what are your thoughts on the Wall Street Journal article, as well as the article on the physician at the University of Michigan, and sort of the direction of where medicine is going?
Yeah, I mean, you're right that it seems postmodernism is eating its own. I liken it to, it's a parasite, that kills the host, and the host being just the entire Western civilization and the inheritance we have of that was birthed out of the Enlightenment, the good parts of the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, and all the advances made in the medical industry. And here we are, where no good thing is too good that the DEI monster can't take over and suck dry of whatever cultural, material influence it has. But yeah, it is the zeitgeist, like you said. They all see it as, major corporations see, well, if we don't have a diversity and inclusion chief, then people aren't going to invest in our company. And if our university doesn't have it, then we're not going to get donors, and we're not going to get applicants. And any medical establishment, we're not going to get the grants. We're not going to get big fat contracts for research. And it's all, I mean, at the end of it, it's all a grab for money and a grab for notoriety from people in power. And they just so happen to hold on to their power right now by pushing the woke agenda. And so it seems where it's coming from. It's just not a surprise that we're just seeing it show up everywhere. And but I am heartened by the individuals you mentioned out of the University of Michigan, and yourself and others that are taking the fight, to a different field, whether it's private practice or whether it's starting, someone starting their own college, someone starting their own institution for research. That's the divestment that's got to happen, I think, where if you're dependent on Caesar for your existence, you're dependent on Caesar for money to do what you're trying to do, then at the end of the day, Caesar's gonna tell you what to spend that money on. That seems to be the way it goes. Every school that's not toeing the trans line, every even elementary school that's not going to be gender affirming, they're not getting school lunch. They're not getting federal assistance for school lunch. So, we're subjecting children to it. We're subjecting, and in the case of the Wall Street Journal article, we're subjecting patients to this. And there won't be any end to it until individuals and groups of people say enough is enough. It has its power through, through the power of the purse. So I think that's where we might actually see some things change. Where, hey, if we're not devoted to getting money from the government, getting money from investors that actually don't have the best interest in mind, till then we won't see the change we want.
Yeah. Speaking of that, and I want to sort of wrap up with this last story that I think has a lot of connection to what we've been talking about, and then maybe finish off with a short passage of scripture that I'd like to hear your thoughts on as well. So the last story of today has to deal with, speaking of students, the student loan forgiveness mandate that is being handed down from on high by the current regime. And I guess the plan is that there's going to be $10,000 in student debt relief that is going to be given to every student who owes student debt in the United States, up to $125,000. If I get the numbers correct. And if you have Pell Grants, you can get as much as $20,000 forgiven. It seems like the numbers are supposed to reduce the overall loan balances by about $300 to $400 billion, depending on what number you look at. But yeah, what are your thoughts on this particular story? What does it tell us about man's view of money versus the scripture's view of money, and the scripture's commendation to borrowing and lending, and what does it say about where we're at in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, sort of what I was driving at a minute ago. The scriptures would say the borrower is slave to the lender, and this is more of the same. Universities receive lots of money from state governments and federal governments, all in the name of, whether it be research or anymore, making college, quote, more affordable, whether that's like through these lottery programs, all in the name of making college more affordable. And all it's done is subsidized them and driven the cost up more and more astronomically. And as a result of that, everyone's carrying this debt. It's, quote, good debt, at the end of your college career, and after some period of time in the workforce, you're going to be getting a return on that investment. So the idea is, lend money because you will be able to pay it back, because there's going to be a job at the end of that college career. And all that to say, we've turned higher education into a money-making scheme. It's a money-making scheme for everybody. And the government always wants a piece of that action, so if it means getting a loan through the government, that seems to be where a lot of this is coming from, so that they have power to forgive a certain amount of debt. And I don't think that they're going to be able to wipe out everyone's loans I guess insofar as they're able to print money willy-nilly, then it doesn't even matter what they're doing with funding kids' scholarships with federal money. But um, it is that it all comes down to the borrower is slave to the lender. You won't get the money that you want for the degree you want um, if it's the federal government giving you the money. If you're not a favored DEI participant, then you might not be getting that debt forgiveness. That's where this goes next. It's not going to be applied across the board even-handedly. It's going to be a wealth transfer. That's what this amounts to. Folks that are still in debt, uh, they're going to use this as a means to target a wealth and income redistribution that favors your DEI participants, the beneficiaries of the DEI programs. Yeah, that's the upshot of it all. It's a means of paying off the woke ideology. But even more cynical than that. It's a power grab, and it's just to try to grab some votes. It seems like there's some lockstep strategy in play on the Democratic side of things that, hey, if we can promise that we're going to relieve this debt, we're going to get all these young people voting for us because we're basically going to buy their votes somehow. And then if it doesn't work out, it doesn't pass because it ultimately gets stricken by the Supreme Court, struck down once it actually goes into law, hypothetically. Hey, they'll use that as more political haymaking to say, hey, if you elect us, we'll get all our liberal judges in the Supreme Court so that we can reverse this law, reverse that ruling to get the law. So it's all a matter of blackmail, politically speaking, and buying votes. Hey, we'll give you $10,000. Hey, just vote for us. That's what it kind of amounts to. But I said a minute ago, it's a wealth redistribution, it's wealth transfer, and that's doubtless what it is. Myself, I've paid off my student loans. Plenty of others haven't even gone to college and accrued that kind of debt. Farmer Joe over in Georgia that never went to college, he's paid off every bit of debt he has, and if he still has debt on his land or on his farm equipment, he's not getting any money for that. So he's ultimately paying for it, so that underwater women's basket weaving classes can be paid for.
Yeah, I'll just run a couple of numbers for you right now. Total U.S. student loan debt is currently valued at $1.6 trillion, which means the 300 to 400 billion that is supposedly going to be paid off in a certain amount of time is a drop in the bucket.
Sure.
Current national debt is somewhere between 30 and 32 trillion dollars, which is about right around 100% of our total GDP. Unfunded liabilities, along with our national debt, it's about $144 trillion. We are a society that no longer values production and hard work. We are a society that has become based upon consumption, that in a lot of ways it's been external forces as well. You look at all the companies that have shipped out jobs to hostile foreign powers overseas, at the expense of the American taxpayer. It's been absolutely devastating. I mean, we've gone from a country that had the world's largest economy in the 1890s, that produced 94% of its GDP that, or 94% of its economic growth was entirely domestic, to a country that is now becoming slaves, a slave to foreign creditors, that has become a slave to its own lusts. And I just don't see any good way out of this. When you talk about wealth transfer, you're exactly correct. I have a lot more student loan debt from medical school. Fortunately, I have none from undergrad, than the $10,000 that is going to be forgiven. But I also have essentially taken that debt on as a mortgage for a career that's going to be able to give me the financial means to pay off that debt very quickly, a lot more quickly than people who've gone for other degrees. So it's not really going to have a big impact on my overall debt burden. And what it's going to do is it's going to continue to devalue the dollar to make our investments less valuable. And it's not going to have an appreciable impact on the people who are carrying the most debt, who by and large are physicians and people in professional schools who are going to have salaries to pay it off. And it's transferring money from day laborers and carpenters and contractors and farmers and people who didn't go to college to physicians and lawyers and PhDs and people who are going to be able to make more money than them, or at the very least hold a higher position in, our society by virtue of their letters. I really don't think it's a higher position in society in actuality. I much prefer blue-collar workers to many of the people that I've met in academia, and think they are providing a much more valuable service than many of the people I meet on university campuses. But yeah, it's to me, it's criminal that you're taking money from people who never went to college, who are working in blue-collar fields or the service economy, to pay for doctors. And I find that just absolutely reprehensible. And it's clearly a naked vote grab by the Demon Party, as I like to call it, that isn't going to work out well. It's a quick money grab, and it's just another in the long line of bad decisions that have happened since the current regime took power last January, that have only made us weaker and more impoverished as a nation. So, not sure there's much we can do about it except, vote and raise our families and, trust in God's providence, regardless of what happens to this nation.
Yeah, agreed.
So with that, just read a quick passage of scripture. Then I wanted to read a comment as we close out the night. Tiger Emissary, sort of rounding all of this up, talking about, the situation with the cross-politic guys, medical education, situation with student debt. And a lot of what we're talking about is who we are indebted to and who is master over us. What is the relationship of church and state? What is the relationship of the state to the individual? And I just thought about this recently. I've been, reading and listening to a lot of Roman history and the past year or so, and was listening to a podcast recently on the Jewish-Roman War, describing the causes for the Judean revolt in 66 AD, and just thinking about what Christ had prophesied at his his crucifixion. And the long and short of it is that the Jews actually had made a deal with the Roman emperors over, from the time of Augustus up until the time of the revolt under Nero, where they had actually been given, relative to a lot of other client peoples in the Roman Empire, a fairly cushy position. The temple was allowed to remain intact. The priests were allowed to collect a large amount of taxes, not just from Jews in the Roman Empire, but also Jews in the Parthian Empire to the east, which is modern-day Iran, historic Persia. And so the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem had a very cozy position for a long time, but it came with strings attached, and that was loyalty to Caesar and his government. And that could be taken away at any moment. And so what happened is that Nero, because of his profligate ways, towards the end of his short and miserable life, needed extra tax money. And so he wanted to go raid all of the provinces for money as he was building his great Domus Aureus, his golden house in Rome, which some people accused him of setting the Great Fire in Rome. So he could clear land to build his great golden house. And then he blamed the Christians for the fire. My personal opinion, I think the fire was an accident and Nero used it for political expediency. So the Jews suddenly found themselves, and I'm speaking specifically of the Judean Jewish leadership, found themselves being confronted with tax collectors and auxiliary soldiers trying to raid the coffers of the Jewish temple. And this is what precipitated the rebellion. And it's interesting because this cozy position that they had had with Rome for many years came to be the undoing of that very nation. And I just think about Jesus's trial before Pilate, where starting in John chapter 19, we'll start with verse 1. Pilate then took Jesus and flogged him, and when the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and put a purple robe on him. And they were coming out to him and saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and were giving him slaps in the face. And Pilate came out again and said to them, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you, so that you may know that I find no guilt in him." Jesus then came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." And when the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify, crucify." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." Then the Jews answered him, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he made himself out to be the Son of God." Therefore, when Pilate heard this statement, he became more afraid, and he entered into the praetorium again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate said to him, "You do not speak to me. Do you not know that I have authority to release you, and I have authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin." As a result of this, Pilate kept seeking to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself to be a king opposes Caesar." Therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." So they cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priest answered, "We have no king but Caesar." John chapter 19, 1 through 15. Give me your thoughts on this Tiger Emissary as it relates to the stories that we presented today, and maybe conclusions we can draw in regards to proper authority. And I'll give you mine at the end.
Yeah, there's a passage that's kind of right in the middle of what you were reading, where Jesus is confronted by Pilate, and he says, all those who follow me follow the truth. And Pilate says, what is truth? And Jesus also says, my kingdom is not of this world. And those are the two things that I feel like we're seeing, the themes in our conversations tonight. We who follow Jesus follow him because he is the truth. And unless that's the case, we're either denying the truth or we're just simply pretending the truth doesn't exist. Like Pilate, who says, what is truth? For him and for the Roman civilization, for the Roman government, there was only power. There was valor and honor, but not truth, because truth ultimately would mean that they're accountable, that Pilate was accountable to someone. And that's what we see right now. I said that postmodernism is a virus that's eating up the entire Western heritage, and it's a denial of truth. It's a refusal to acknowledge the truth, and that's the results we see. And we want to crucify the truth. And so, kind of almost in an allegoristic way, that's what we're doing. We're reenacting what Pilate was allowing to happen to Christ.
Yeah, just a couple of historical commentaries that I think add some color to this particular story. If you go back to the Old Testament and the children of Israel, and you look at what God was intending in the giving of the law, in the covenanting of himself with the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. And he sought to be in his prescriptive will. Obviously, his decretive will is different. His secret will was only revealed at a later time. It even still has not been fully revealed. But in his prescriptive will, God himself sought to be the king of the nation of Israel. But they didn't want to live under his law. And it was an act of the will. It was something related to their volition. They did it voluntarily. They rebelled voluntarily against the Lord and against his good law. And they wouldn't have him as their king. And so they cried out for a king. And so he gave them Saul, and then he gave them David. And then we see even the failings of the kings in the Davidic line in Judah, let alone what happened in the northern kingdom with Israel. And now you come down to the time of Christ and his earthly ministry, and the Jews. It's just so interesting. This statement that the chief priests make in verse 15: "We have no king but Caesar." First of all, they had a client king in Herod, who was over them. I believe it was Herod Agrippa at that time. So much for Herod, I guess, according to the chief priests. But secondly, which is an absolutely amazing statement for anybody who knows anything about Roman history, When Augustus became emperor, he clearly cloaked his position in the Republican veneer of the ancient Roman Republic. According to Roman legend, the Romans drove out their last king over half a millennia before Augustus came to power, and the Romans were absolutely allergic to anything related to monarchy, if you want to call it that, especially during this time period where the Republic had only ceased to have existed, in real terms, 60 years before. But all of the same, facade of Republican government still existed at that time. So much so that Caesar was not a king. He was merely the princeps, the first citizen among all the Roman citizens. And so, to me, what this speaks to is the absolute depth of depravity that God had given over the religious leaders of his people to in this hour, that not only would they ignore the client king that was already over them, as well as, in the greatest sense, the fact that he himself had come to them in the flesh, and they're rejecting him as their king, to where they are literally calling a foreign ruler who is not himself actually a king, their only king. And so when I learned all of this history and then I read that passage again, to me it just speaks to the absolute depth of depravity that we see when a society has been given over to its sin and its lusts. And what a judgment it was upon that generation. That is the final word of their leaders to Pilate at the trial of Jesus. We have no king but Caesar. Just an amazing statement. Any final thoughts on that, Tiger Emissary, before we wrap up with one final thing?
No, that was great. I really appreciate your thoughts on that.
So I want to read a comment that I got on my life update and welcome back video that I did just a couple weeks ago, that I showed you. I just want to get your thoughts on this, and maybe the 1 year retrospective of a little encounter that I had with a certain individual on YouTube. So I'll just read the comment. It's from a guy, 7 Emmanuel 7. He says, "Hey, Dr. Bob, I'm looking forward to more live streams and content from you. The Lord saved me 10 years ago. I was attending a Baptist church. Prior to that, I was a traditional Lakota pipe keeper and sun dancer. It's a long story. 3 years ago, I was in a pretty bad crash in a company truck. During my recovery period, I was severely concussed. I drank some of the online Kool-Aid, example, Brother Augustine stuff, and determined to become Orthodox. Long story short, I was baptized Orthodox after a year of being a catechumen, and then the priest excommunicated me 2 months later. No idea why. Shocked, I drove 16 hours to see my bishop. Basically, all he had to offer was, you have a good priest. My priest was an octogenarian archimandrite. I believe that's some sort of monastic priest. It took me quite a while to muddle through what was going on by reading scripture and a lot of prayer before I came to precisely the questions you addressed so eloquently in several videos on your channel. The priesthood. Once I clearly understood that there is no separate priesthood under the new covenant, everything else that is biblically, theologically erroneous about the EO church snapped into focus. Alas, your videos came along too late to help me process things biblically. Having said that, I'm thoroughly enjoying them and I look forward to more of your reviews and discussions. Given the number of Christians who are being deceived by the claims of the EO church, this is an important discussion. God bless you."
Yeah, that's pretty amazing.
First of all, I just want to say thank you to Emmanuel. I hope that you're doing better with your pain, and that you're getting good medical care wherever you're at. Really, it's just heartwarming to me. That whole endeavor that I went through a year ago was not quite what I expected. Lost a friendship over it, and you know, have a little bit cooler relationship with some other people that I consider friends as well, who come from that particular perspective. Just wanted to say I have nothing against people in the Eastern Orthodox Communion. I just wanted to stand up for what I believe is true of Scripture. Prepared for that debate with the best of intentions and the best of will, the best of my ability after studying what I had studied. And I think that that particular issue in particular cuts to the heart of the issue, and comes back once again to this issue of authority, as well as the very issue of salvation itself and what does it mean to be a Christian. And I think things have borne out quite well for our side since then, given what's happened in Ukraine in February and the behavior of the hierarchy of the Russian Orthodox Church in the meantime. And I just want to say that Christ's church is not bound by any one ecclesiastical organization, and his working through his Holy Spirit is not bound by ecclesiastical claims of hierarchy or authority or apostolic succession. As John the Baptist stated, that God could raise up children of Israel from the stones. So the same providential working of God can raise up Christians, regardless if anyone has stepped inside one of the cathedrals of or churches of any of the various communions that claim such authority or who claim to be the one true church. I would say I believe there are believers and potential brothers and sisters in Christ in the Eastern Orthodox Communion, as well as the Roman Catholic Communion, but I would say that's in spite of official teaching of those churches on the areas in which we would be in dispute. Mm-hmm. And it's the gospel itself and faith in that gospel, apart from any works of merit on our own, or works that even we have done in righteousness, as Titus says, or as Paul says to Titus in Titus chapter 3, verse 5. But salvation is purely a work of grace. And even when we are working, it is only because God is working in us. And if God has started something, no one can confound him, and he will see it through to its end. So, did you have any final thoughts to close us out, Tiger Emissary, on that or any of the other topics we discussed in this live stream?
No, you had shared with me that comment from Emmanuel, I think you said was his name.
Yeah,
and that was great. Just really shows that there's some fruit that's come out of your discussions and your efforts, though frustrating as they were at that time. And it's good to always see that sometimes there's some fruit that comes out of arguments online. Even if it's not convincing your opponent, there's everyone who's watching us, and we're bearing witness for the gospel as we do that. So glad to see there was some fruit. Glad to see that there's some encouragement as well.
Yeah. That debate for me, as I tried to keep my cool throughout and be as polite as I could, I wasn't thinking primarily of my opponent, but of the audience and the people who would hear it. And I think it continues to age better and better for our side and less well for the other side as time goes along. So with that, thank you for joining me, Tiger Emissary. Really enjoyed having you on the channel again. We need to do it again sometime, brother.
Yeah.
If you have any guys that you know would want to join us at some point, who have some things that they'd like to add to the conversation, I would be more than happy to have them. There's a lot more to discuss with issues in the Southern Baptist Convention related to various happenings here and there. But I'm really glad you're able to join me today.
Yeah, this is great. It's always good to hop on the show.
And one final thing. I know it may seem kind of trite to some people or quaint or provincial, but you and I are both from the South, and Southern college football is about to resume. You were an alumnus of that school in, Pickens County, South Carolina?
Yeah.
There in the upstate.
Pride of Pickens.
The pride of
the Blue Ridge yawns its greatness.
Yes, you are not an LSU Tiger or an Auburn Tiger or a Princeton Tiger, but you are indeed a Clemson Tiger. Much to, not my chagrin, but my perpetual disappointment when it comes to the current state of my alma mater's football program. I am an alumnus of the Georgia Institute of Technology, the famous Ramblin' Wreck from Georgia Tech, and our teams have a date in Mercedes-Benz Stadium on Labor Day.
The Benz.
What's your score prediction for the game?
Well, I think compared to last year, Clemson should be able to score a little bit more than last time. I have some confidence that the quarterback situation is a little bit better, and the defense will be very good for Clemson this year. So I'm thinking Clemson's winning streak continues over Georgia Tech, though it was close last year, almost a few inches away from getting broken. But I'm going to say 28-14. Give you guys a couple touchdowns, but I think Clemson's going to do a little bit better than their average score last year. So they kind of try to work out some bugs at the beginning of the year. I don't know if we'll be a high-scoring offense, but it'll be a comfortable win.
Yeah. Tech is an enigma this year. Our best player transferred out, but we got a bunch of other guys who.
That was a shame. To Alabama, of all places.
Of course, we got two kids from Alabama in the offseason. We picked up two players from Clemson in the offseason. This is a weird rivalry. I feel like in recent years, you guys have either dominated us or we have snuck up and have kept it close. From my memories, my first Georgia Tech game I watched as a young kid was in 2002 when we got clobbered by that school from Athens in Mark Richt's second year at UGA. Second game I watched was when we upset Auburn in 2003. Tore down the goalposts. That was Bobby Dodd Stadium. It was when Bobby Dodd had been updated. We did well in the Benz last year. We had a big upset at Carolina, blowout win there. I am going to say my first Georgia Tech Clemson game that I watched was in 2004. I believe that game was on ABC, and it was Brent Musburger who had the call. And I remember we were down 10 points late in the fourth quarter. We're able to score a touchdown, gave the ball back to you guys with about a minute and a half left. We were able to get a 3-and-out, used all our timeouts, and I forget the name of the long snapper and the punter that you guys had in that game, but the long snapper snapped the ball on the ground, rolled around. The punter fell on the ball, but it was the 10-yard line. And on the very next play, Reggie Ball threw the ball up to the corner of the end zone to a young Georgia Tech freshman receiver named Calvin Johnson. And he caught the ball for the improbable game-winning touchdown in Tiger Stadium in Death Valley. And the legend was born.
The legend of Megatron.
That day. I'm glad we got you guys on week 1, because I think week 1 is teams are not quite what they are later in the season, and some weird things happen on week 1. And so I have to go with the history of the rivalry, with weird things happening between Clemson and Georgia Tech. And in honor of that game, I'm going to say that Jeff Sims has the game of his life, like he did against Carolina last year, and that we win the game by a score of 28-24, just like we did in 2004.
Okay.
In a last-second improbable upset to reinvigorate the rivalry and to save Jeff Collins' job.
That would do it. That would do it for sure.
Well, with that being said, we'll see how wrong my prediction is on Labor Day night, but I will enjoy the 5% chance if that 5% chance does come to happen.
You're saying there's a chance.
I am saying there is a chance, a non-zero chance of that prediction coming true. So, well, we'll have to get together. We'll have to go to a game at some point.
Yeah. I was going to suggest this was a good game for us to meet up at, but Georgia Tech preferred that they not fill up the stadium, so it made tickets pretty hard to get.
Yep, they wanted the same configuration as the Carolina game last year, so hoping the voodoo magic works twice in a row, but I don't know. We'll see. All right, Tiger Emissary, we'll go ahead and call the stream with that. Thank you, everybody who joined us. Feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see y'all on the next one. Take care.
Thanks.
Grace and peace, and God bless.
All right.